At some point, finishing a game stopped meaning what it used to. The credits still roll, the story still closes, but the game keeps asking you to stay. That shift didn't happen all at once. It grew slowly, alongside the way games were built, sold, and played. To understand why games feel endless now, you have to look back at what they originally were designed to do. There's a certain way we tend to talk about games now. We describe them as places, as stories, as experiences that unfold over time. That language feels normal today. It feels like the natural way to think about what games are. But it didn't begin that way. In the earliest commercial form, games weren't built around immersion or narrative. They were built around function. They existed as machines designed to generate revenue, and that purpose shaped everything about how they worked. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the dominant form of gaming wasn't the console or the PC, it was the arcade. Arcade games were coin operated, each play required payment, each failure meant starting over, each attempt at improvement came with a cost. The relationship between player and machine was immediate and transactional. You inserted money, you were given time. Manufacturers either sold these cabinets outright or rented them to business owners. Ownership changed who handled maintenance, but the underlying logic stayed the same. Every cabinet had to earn. Where these machines were placed mattered. Arcades appeared in spaces where people already gathered. Malls, theaters, convenience stores, restaurants, bars. These were locations built around waiting, lingering, and passing time. Games fit into that rhythm easily, and they did more than fill time, they extended it. Longer visits meant more purchases. Food, drinks, alcohol. Some arcades replaced coins with proprietary tokens. That solved logistical problems, but it also kept money inside the space. If you left with unused tokens, their value stayed behind. Returning wasn't just encouraged, it was built into the system. Design followed this structure. Difficulty wasn't only a creative choice, it was a financial one. Arcade games escalated quickly, they became more demanding the longer you played. Sessions were brief, intense, and rarely resolved. That shape encouraged repeated attempts. Repeated attempts meant repeated spending. A game that could be completed easily wouldn't sustain itself, so games were tuned around near success. They created moments where players felt close, capable, almost there, then they ended. Pac-Man accelerated as you progressed. The maze became more chaotic. The ghosts moved faster. Survival required sharper reactions with less room for error. Space Invaders introduced a small feature that had an outsized effect: persistent high scores. Your name could remain on the machine, not temporarily, but for as long as it stayed. That single change shifted how people thought about play. It added memory, it added status, it added a sense of presence. Players weren't only trying to improve, they were trying to be seen. The scale of this economy was enormous. By 1982, the US arcade industry generated more than $8 billion annually. Individual cabinets often cost a few $1,000s and could earn hundreds per week. In some locations, they could earn even more. Short sessions weren't a limitation, they were the product. Arcade games revolved around loops. You played, you failed, you tried again. Progress meant surviving longer, reacting faster, reaching a little further than before. There was no narrative resolution waiting, there was only the next attempt. These games weren't shaped around stories, they were shaped around performance. They didn't ask what would happen next, they asked how long you could last. Over time, the place where people played began to change. Games started moving into homes, and when that happened, the meaning of play began to change with them. When games entered the home, they entered a different kind of relationship with players. Arcades were public spaces, people came and went, time was shared, attention was divided, play happened in short bursts, often between other things. The home was different. It was private, stable, repetitive, the same rooms, the same screen, the same couch. Games were no longer competing with other players standing nearby. They were competing with television, with books, with boredom, with other routines. That change forced designers to evolve. In 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey became the first commercially available home console.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future.
Its technology was limited, simple shapes moving across the screen, supported by plastic overlays that players placed on the television to simulate environments. It barely resembled what we think of as a video game today. What mattered wasn't how it looked, what mattered was where it lived. It existed in people's homes.
I'd like the most popular home video game system ever.
The system you want is the Atari 2600.
A few years later, the Atari 2600 expanded that idea. Swappable cartridges meant that a single machine could host many games. A standardized platform meant developers could build a growing library around shared hardware. Arcade hits like Pac-Man and Space Invaders could now be played at home for a single upfront cost. That detail changed the meaning of value. Arcade games earn money through repetition. Home games earn money through depth. If someone paid full price for a cartridge, they expected something in return. The time, complexity, a sense of involvement, design had to adjust. Short punishing loops no longer made sense. Players weren't feeding coins into a slot, they were sitting down with intention. They wanted a reason to stay and a reason to care. This is where stories began to matter. Not in the way novels mattered, not in the way films mattered, but more as a structural guide. Players needed direction, a sense of progress, a way to understand where they were and where they were headed. In 1981, Donkey Kong introduced brief narrative cutscenes that framed the player's movement through the game. The story itself was simple, but it gave context to the action. Each level felt like a step rather than an isolated challenge. Shigeru Miyamoto described this approach as a way to make the whole story visible on the screen. The goal wasn't complexity, it was clarity. Though this was not an arcade, players could tell that something was unfolding. That feeling changed how people related to games. Once players could see an endpoint, they could aim for it. Reaching the end began to matter. Credits became a kind of punctuation. They signaled that something had been completed, their effort had led somewhere, their time had produced a result. Players weren't just trying to improve their performance, they were trying to arrive. This shift reshaped what games were allowed to be. Developers began building longer campaigns, worlds that unfolded gradually, mechanics that layered over time, characters that persisted across sessions. Value was no longer measured by how often someone failed, it was measured by how deeply they became involved. And with that came a new emotional structure. Players began to replay games to relive experiences rather than to prove mastery. Moments became memories, stories became personal. Games stopped feeling like tests, they began to feel like journeys. But something else was happening alongside this change. As endings became meaningful, designers also began experimenting with ways to extend play beyond the story. At first, this wasn't about money, it was about curiosity, it was about possibilities, it was about seeing what else a system could do. That curiosity would eventually reshape the medium. For a time, games felt complete. You bought them, played them, reached the end. The structure made sense once games lived in homes. Stories had shape, progress had direction, endings carried weight. But alongside this new focus on completion, another current was forming. One that didn't depend on narrative at all. As home consoles were rising, so were early computer games. These weren't built for living rooms, they were built for terminals, university labs, shared machines. Their limitations were obvious, graphics were minimal or non-existent, interaction happened through text and symbols. What they lacked in presentation, they made up for in systems. In 1978, a small game called Beneath Apple Manor appeared. It offered a dungeon to explore, rooms to uncover, danger to avoid, and there was no story to resolve. Progress was defined by how far you managed to go. 2 years later, Rogue refined that idea. Its dungeon was procedurally generated. Each playthrough rearranged the world. Items behaved differently each time. Potions changed colors. Outcomes had to be learned, guessed, and tested. Death carried consequences. When you failed, the run ended. You started over. Every decision mattered. This wasn't an ending in a traditional sense. It was a boundary. Rogue did have an ending, but it was deliberately distant. Recovering the amulet was only half the challenge. Getting back out alive meant surviving the same dangers again, often under harsher conditions. Progress lived inside this loop. What Rogue introduced wasn't a post-game, it was a replay structure. Players weren't meant to finish the game and walk away, they were meant to return with knowledge, with sharper judgment, and better instincts. That approach gave rise to an entire family of games: Hack, NetHack, and Moria. Each iteration reinforced the same idea: a single game could contain endless variation. This concept didn't remain confined to text. In 1996, Diablo carried it into a new space. The game presented a clear story, there were acts, bosses, and a final confrontation, but the structure didn't stop there. After the credits rolled, players could return at higher difficulties. Normal became nightmare, nightmare became hell, enemies hit harder, loot became more powerful, builds became more specialized. The story remained the same, the systems deepened. Loot changed everything. Items carried random attributes. Rarity mattered. Some combinations felt transformative, others felt useless. Inventory space forced decisions about what to keep and what to leave behind. Progress no longer ended with the narrative, it extended through optimization. Players weren't chasing a conclusion, they were chasing potential. At the same time, a different branch of experimentation was unfolding. Text-based multiplayer worlds began appearing on early networks. Games like Colossal Cave Adventure and early MUDs offered shared spaces rather than isolated runs. These worlds didn't reset when one player left, they persisted. Progress was saved, characters grew, achievements accumulated, endings didn't make sense here. You didn't finish a world that other people were still living in. These systems introduced something new: presence. You weren't just playing through content, you were occupying a space. Your character existed even when you logged off. Over time, these ideas evolved into early online role-playing games. Ultimate Online brought persistence to a wider audience. EverQuest expanded it into a three-dimensional world. Progression systems grew deeper, gear tiers emerged, group activities became essential. Reaching the end of a story didn't signal completion, it unlocked a different phase of play.
Drums of war, thunder, once again.
With World of Warcraft, this structure reached a mainstream audience. Endgame became explicit. Raids, dungeons, gear progression, seasonal content. The game taught players something quietly important: the story was only beginning. At this point, the idea of an ending had changed. Stories still existed, they still mattered, but they were no longer the final destination. They became gateways. This shift didn't happen because designers wanted games to last forever. It happened because systems made it possible. Replay had proven viable, persistence had proven engaging, optimization had proven compelling. Games had learned how to extend themselves, and once that door opened, it never fully closed again. By the time endgame systems became familiar to players, the groundwork had already been laid. Replay had proven viable, persistence had proven compelling, optimization had proven engaging. Games had learned how to extend themselves. What changed next wasn't design curiosity, it was economics. For much of gaming's early history, revenue arrived up front. You bought a cabinet, you bought a cartridge, you bought a disc. Once the transaction was complete, the relationship between player and game largely ended. As development costs rose and audiences expanded, that model began to strain. Games became more expensive to make, teams grew larger, production cycles stretched longer, risk increased. Publishers began looking for ways to stabilize revenue beyond the moment of release. One of the earliest signs of this shift appeared in online games. RuneScape introduced tiered subscription models. World of Warcraft followed with monthly fees that tied revenue directly to continued engagement. The longer players stayed, the more viable they became. Time inside the game began to matter financially. This logic expanded rapidly. Free-to-play models emerged, removing the upfront costs entirely. Instead of selling access, games sold presence. Cosmetics, convenience, progression boost, optional content. Only a fraction of players spent the money, but those who did often spent heavily. A small percentage of users accounted for a significant share of revenue. Design adjusted accordingly. By the mid-2000s, microtransactions had entered mainstream gaming. Bethesda's horse armor in The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion became a cultural reference point, less because of its content and more because of what it represented. Games were no longer just products, they were platforms. Live service models formalized this shift. Games as a service reframed development as an ongoing process rather than a finite one. Content was no longer something that shipped once, it arrived in updates, seasons, expansions, and events. Revenue followed that cadence. Players weren't expected to finish and move on, they were expected to remain. Retention became the central metric. Executives began tracking daily active users, monthly engagement, session length, churn. These numbers shaped decisions at every level. What players spent time on mattered more than what they completed. If a feature held attention, it returned in the next update. If an activity drove engagement, it was expanded. Roadmaps became promises, calendars replaced conclusions. Endgame systems fit perfectly into this structure. They provided ongoing goals without requiring a narrative closure. They offered progression without finality. They created reasons to log in repeatedly. Raids, seasonal ranks, gear tiers, battle passes. Each system extended play without resolving it. Battle passes and seasonal cycles added another layer. Progress became time-bound, rewards appeared and disappeared, missing a window meant losing access to content. Participation turned into urgency. Logging in wasn't just about desire, it became about timing. Monetization attached itself to progression. Loot systems encouraged repetition, cosmetic items were forced identity, gacha mechanics layered chance onto investment. These systems weren't invented to frustrate players, they were built to function within economic constraints that rewarded continued engagement. As studios grew larger and more visible to investors, performance indicators became part of a public valuation. Retention and recurring revenue shaped stock prices, Design decisions began reflecting that pressure. This shift changed how games were built. Endings became interruptions rather than conclusions. Finite experiences created drop-off. Infinite systems sustained value. A game that ended cleanly left money on the table. By this point, endgame was no longer an experiment, it was infrastructure. What began as a way to extend play had become a requirement to sustain the business itself. And once that happened, the question was no longer whether games would end, it was what endless play would do to the people inside it. By this point, the shape of modern games began to make sense. Systems extend play, economics reward retention, endgame becomes infrastructure. What remains is the human side of that equation. What it feels like to play inside systems that are designed to continue. Over time, incentives stop feeling abstract. They become experiences. Progress bars, daily objectives, streaks, seasonal resets, these systems don't just track behavior, they track how players think about effort and time. They suggest what matters. They quietly define what progress looks like. Logging in becomes routine. Goals become scheduled. Rewards arrive on clock. Play settles into rhythm. Psychology helps explain why this works. Operant conditioning describes how behavior responds to consequences. Actions followed by rewards tend to repeat. Systems that vary when and how those rewards arrive tend to hold attention longer. Games use this structure constantly. Some rewards arrive on fixed schedules, others appear unpredictably, some require repetition, others require patience. Together they create loops that encourage continued engagement. Over time, these loops stop feeling like decisions, they begin to feel like habits. Habit forms when actions repeat under similar conditions. Daily logins, weekly milestones, seasonal progression, timed events, each system reinforces the next. Miss a day and progress stalls. Miss a week and rewards disappear. This doesn't require coercion, it relies on consistency. Players adjust their behavior to fit the system. As time accumulates, meaning shifts. Players invest hours, they build characters, they unlock cosmetics, they refine builds, they leave marks behind. At a certain point, play turns into maintenance. The game becomes a record of effort, a history of time spent, a visible measure of persistence. Walking away can feel heavier than expected, not because of addiction, but because of attachment. Economics describes this as sunk cost. Psychology describes it as ownership. People value what they invest in, they protect what feels personal. Progress begins to matter beyond mechanics. Social systems deepen this effect. In persistent multiplayer spaces, endings lose relevance. You don't finish a world other people still inhabit, you exit it. That distinction carries weight. Leaving can feel like falling behind, like abandoning shared routines, like stepping away from a version of yourself that exists inside that space. Identity becomes distributed across avatars, names, guilds, cosmetics, and statistics. Belonging becomes a reason to stay. Over time, something subtle can happen. The feeling of wanting to play shifts. Logging in starts to feel expected. Progress feels time sensitive. Missing content feels consequential. Play becomes obligation adjacent. This doesn't happen because players lack discipline. It happens because systems are designed without natural stopping points. Endless structures produce endless pressure. Burnout follows naturally. Repetition dulls novelty. Constant objectives flatten satisfaction. Rewards lose meaning when they never resolve. Players step away feeling tired rather than fulfilled. Progress continues without them. Seasons roll forward. Events rotate. The game moves on. This is where something important is lost. Endings matter. They allow reflection. They give shape to memory. They create space to step back and say, that meant something. When games remove endings, they remove closure. Experiences blur together. Progress stretches forward without punctuation. Stopping feels unresolved. This isn't a condemnation of modern games. It's an explanation of why they feel the way they do. Designers respond to incentives, players respond to systems, economics shape structure, structure shapes experience. No single decision creates this outcome, it emerges. And that brings us back to the question this video began with. Why did games stop ending? The answer isn't found in any one genre or era. It lives in the slow evolution of business models, design systems, and player expectations. Games didn't lose endings overnight, they learned how to continue. The question that remains isn't whether this is good or bad, it's what replaced endings once they disappeared. That question will guide everything that follows. In the next video, we'll look at what replaced endings and what it means to play inside systems that never stop.